and I'm pleased to welcome you to our clan house here in the Walter Soboleff building. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Steve Langdon, but before doing so, I have a few announcements. First and foremost is to invite you to Celebration 2020, coming up June 10th to 13th this next summer. That's our biggest event. We hold that every other year, and 3 days of dancing and celebrations and parade and all sorts of associated events. So please come and invite your family to attend. Also, we have more lectures in this series, and there's a schedule of the lectures. We have at least 1 or 2 lectures every week this month, hosting celebrating Native American Heritage Month, so please, there's a schedule out on the table, so please take one of those. And if you remember to sign in, that would be helpful. We do that for our grant, recording, documentation, reporting. So, the other thing is we will have a microphone set up on the floor for questions afterwards. Whoops, it looks like I did something here. For questions afterwards, that'll make sure that everybody hears the question rather than just speaking from the floor. It'll be down there, right next to Kim. Oh yeah, cell phones. Remember, just turn off your cell phone. I always forget to turn off my cell phone, so just please do that. And then we're good. Okay, Dr. Stephen J. Langdon is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology from the University of Alaska, University in Anchorage, where he taught for 38 years. Dr. Langdon has conducted research projects on many public policy issues impacting Alaska Natives over his 45-year career. He has advocated for policies that enhance and promote rural Alaska Native communities and their cultures in such areas as fisheries, lands, tribal government, cultural heritage, customary trade, and co-management. Dr. Langdon has specialized in research on the history and culture of the Tlingit and Haida peoples of Southeast Alaska from pre-contact conditions through the historic period of the 19th and early 20th centuries, U.S. governments. He has conducted extensive research on traditional ecological knowledge and uses of salmon by the Tlingit and Haida, demonstrating their complex and rich relations between people and salmon that sustain their cultures for centuries. His book, The Native People of Alaska, is a widely used introduction to Alaska Native people. The Alaska Native Brotherhood selected him to give a keynote address to their 100th convention in 2012, and he has received the Bullock Prize from the University of Alaska Foundation for Career Excellence in Contributions to Alaska, and the Denali Award from the Alaska Federation of Natives for his contributions to Alaska Native life. This is the highest award given to AFN to non-Native people. Steve will be speaking on A Story Not Told, the Metlakatla Tsimshian Salmon Fishery on the Annette Island Reservation in Alaska. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Chuck. Let me check with my parties to see if, is this thing working that you want to work? Okay, well, I don't have to worry about that. Thank you all for coming today, and I'd like to acknowledge the invitation from Dr. Rosita Worrell to give this presentation, which I greatly appreciate. And before starting my comments, I'd like to acknowledge the assistance of the Metlakatla Indian community in providing information, and specifically the mayor, Carl Cook, and also the director of fisheries, Dustin Winther, who were extremely helpful and supportive in providing information for these remarks. So A Story Not Told is really a title in the context of my long-standing and continuing interest in the conditions, the cultural sustainability and the economic sustainability of the villages of southeastern Alaska. And over the course of my life and my career living and researching throughout the region, I've seen circumstances that have descended upon the rural villages with regard to their economic connections to their resources. And they have been cut over and over and over again, primarily by a combination of state and federal actions that have capitalized access to those resources and made things extremely difficult in these communities. In the context of looking at those things and models of how to move, the Metlakatla community began to emerge through my examining of these conditions and understanding how this particular community, with its specific and unique status as a Indian reservation, trust status reserve in Alaska, has accomplished a salmon fishery as well as other natural resource management. So that's why it's a story not told. It's a story that there are other reasons about that story that pertain to political environments that anyone who's congruent with the history of Alaska politics and Native relations might understand why that might be the case. But at any rate, it's in the context of understanding how community has been able to sustain itself where it has a viable salmon fishery and how it has proceeded on that basis. I will begin with a little historical background about the community before going into the more recent circumstances about how this fishery is conducted and managed. So the Southeast Alaska, this is Southeast Alaska, which everyone knows where we're at. And the red circle at the bottom shows where the Annette Islands Reserve is located. It's located for purposes of the way in which salmon are categorized and enumerated in the southern southeastern Alaska or in District 1, which are the state areas. So oftentimes people look at how the catch there occurs in relationships to those categories. So a little historical background. The term Tsimshian is a linguistic term for three related language populations who occupy the northern British Columbia region in the vicinity of the Nass and Skeena rivers. At contact, the coast Tsimshian, referred to as the Lac Qualam, occupied the lower Skeena River and nearby lands, islands, and waters in what is now northern British Columbia. Following incursions by explorers, the Hudson's Bay Company arrived and established a trading post at Fort Simpson in 1828, where this Coast Tsimshian clan approved that establishment, and many of the Coast Tsimshian took up winter residence at that site and location. Another significant event in 1857, the Anglican missionary William Duncan arrived at Fort Simpson and began his process of proselytization by learning the language and interacting with the clans and the leadership at that time. With the determination of some of the Christian Tsimshian converts, they decided to establish a new community which was built on an older village site and established in 1862. And the community there, once established there, began establishing businesses and became widely recognized for their particular clothing and their approach throughout the Northwest Coast and throughout Southeast Alaska as well. The cannery was established at that time as well. The Tsimshian leaders, backed by Duncan both at Fort Simpson and at Metlakatla, staunchly pursued recognition of their land ownership and resource rights, but they were denied by British Columbia government, which determined that they only had use rights, usufructuary rights. Some of you who are familiar with British Columbia's particular history of land claims will recognize that it is precisely in those people standing up at that time for those rights that ultimately led to their ability to pursue their Aboriginal rights at this time. In order to actually live the life that they had hoped to, the Tsimshian leaders, backed by Duncan, approached the United States government and obtained authorization to move to lands in southeastern Alaska. Specifically, the leaders went up and examined various different locations and determined that the previously occupied village called Taquan on Annette Island would be a good place to relocate. So in 1887, a party of 886 got into their canoes, not a single canoe obviously, and traveled across the water, settling in Taquan at that time. So the historical background in the U.S., when under this authorization, they began to establish their communities, and in 1891, a congressional reserve was created for the residents of the village, and they carried the name Metlakatla to their new residents. By 1892, the Tsimshians, with Duncan's assistance and capital from his supporters in Victorian England, were able to build a cannery and put a sawmill in operation, and they were back into production. Interestingly, when looking at some of the records that down at the Wellcome Collection at the National Archives, I saw a letter Duncan received in 1894, 2 years after the opening of the cannery, from the Alaska Packers Association, telling them how many cases they would be able to sell in the marketplace, and they put a cap on them within 2 years. So they entered into the politics of salmon production and distribution quite early. Now, very significant technical development occurred in the early part of the 20th century, and that was the creation of fish traps. And these first fish traps, beginning right after the turn of the century, were what they called fixed or standing fish traps. And that required the driving of trap posts into the substrate, and then the placing of the lead along those driven posts. Well, the reserve boundary only went down to mean high water. So that meant that there was no protection below mean high water from the establishment of these traps. And so it quickly became recognized by the Tsimshians that these traps could come up to their shores and intercept their fish without any particular, they had no particular legal opportunities to prevent that. So in 1916, they were able to obtain a promulgation to extend the boundary of the reserve 3,000 feet offshore. And it's in that particular promulgation that we find the basis for then the appearance of the fishery and the fishery management aspects of the Annette Island Reserve population. So no one could establish their standing traps. Later on, in the 1920s, with the development of floating fish traps, the Tsimshians developed their own fish trap system, of which they used 4 to 6 for a period of time. I'll comment on that later on to a little bit. In 1923, in a significant act, their reserve with its 3,000-foot boundary was judicially authorized as an established reservation for the benefit of its native residents. In 1959, following the passage of the Statehood Act, the support of which was within the state of Alaska for the outlawing of fish traps, this became a significant nexus of interaction with the Alaska Native communities. Metlakatla had operated fish traps inside their boundaries, but the two villages of Angoon and Cake also had utilized fish traps for a period of time for the provision of fish for their canneries. And the state of Alaska outlawed those, all three of them. They outlawed them on the basis of the outlawing of the traps. Angoon and Cake lost in their particular court suits because they did not have trust land. So they therefore were not under the protection of the federal government. However, Metlakatla won their case, and they continued to be able to use fish traps because as a reservation, they have their own tribal management subject to federal jurisdiction. In 1971, ANCSA came along, and in one of the most fascinating sidebars, subtexts, or footnotes to ANCSA, the Metlakatla community, unlike other reservations, almost all other reserved lands, including the extraordinary Venati Reserve in northeastern Alaska, were revoked under the terms of ANCSA. And I think when I was talking with the mayor and we discussed this particular thing, there's still opacity in my mind as to how that particular exclusion happened, but he did note that there was an explicit vote taken by Metlakatla residents at that particular time, and that there was a 100% vote to stay out of ANCSA. And the motivation behind that was to control their fishery and not become subject to state jurisdiction that would have happened if their reservation was reserved. So that was a very critical turning point in terms of the ability to sustain the reserve and the fishery that had grown up inside those 3,000-foot reservation boundaries. In 1973, this is another very significant and problematic aspect of the nature of the position, the relationship of the Metlakatla fishermen in the community to the state of Alaska. The creation of limited entry capitalized the right to fish. And Metlakatlans had fished throughout southeastern Alaska with their purse seine boats. I remember seeing them up in the Icy Strait region when I fished there in the 70s, and out on the west coast of Prince of Wales Island. The Tsimshian vessels were well known, highly qualified captains and fishermen in those waters. So they clearly had a history of fisheries that would allow them to submit applications for limited entry permits. But lo and behold, according to my Tsimshian sources, the state of Alaska did not, in order to qualify, you had to submit evidence of your history of fishing in southeastern Alaska with purse seines. But the State of Alaska Limited Entry Commission did not recognize landing slips to the Annette Island Packing Company. So as a result of that, knowing, not of the head there, a significant number of Tsimshian drift gill netters and purse seiners didn't receive permits at that time. So at the present time, there are, of the approximately 80, well, there are 15 purse seine vessels that operate, and sometimes 18. Note that number, everybody. They got 15 purse seine vessels, employment associated with it. They have 75 drift gill net fishermen, and all the employment associated with that. Of that 90 fishermen, somewhere around 8, there are about 8 extant limited entry permits for salmon fisheries. And that, of course, does not intimate the other kind of limited entry fisheries that have come about. So in the view of the leaders, this particular aspect of the way in which state management has developed has become a very significant dilemma to posed for the continuity of the fisheries. So this particular map shows then the reserve with its 3,000-foot boundary. And so it is all of the fisheries that occur that are under tribal jurisdiction and management are within those boundaries as well. And that maritime boundary in certain cases, like in Mountain Point at the north end up there, comes quite close to state waters. And it was quite interesting that that it has that 3,000-foot boundary has been sustained even where it does come in closer approximation to the community of the lands of state of Alaska. So I want to look a little bit at some of the demographics of Metlakatla and Annette Island at the present time. The demographics for Metlakatla is that the population is 82% Native American. Median age is 31, population under 18 is 33, and the poverty rate is 7.7. And that's a very important figure in terms of what's going on. Perhaps more significantly, in terms of a comparative understanding vis-a-vis other villages in southeastern Alaska, are the population numbers. And as you can see, they have fluctuated somewhat. In the early years, that fluctuation was due to some struggles over the cannery operations and some internal political struggles between Duncan and the residents. But after about Duncan's passing, that particular problem became resolved. The cannery was built and under the tribal jurisdiction, and from the early part of the 20s forward, things proceeded with that particular principles in mind. So over time we see that the population has increased with a very sharp jump we can see between 1960 and 70. I haven't done the research to see what particular might have militated that particular circumstance. I'm not sure. But since 1970, there has been gradual increase, and the population is now over 1,400. So that's an extremely healthy community, having visited it very recently. A very nice housing stock and other kinds of materials. What caught my eye in doing some research for another project was looking at the website for the community, and there's a drone. They have drone footage of coming in out off the water and then going over their small boat harbor and into the community. And there are they're not small boat harbors, there are two boat harbors in Metlakatla. And I think that if you take a look at that, you can see the number of vessels that are there. And thinking about those numbers that I told you about before, and think about those in the context of the flyovers of any other native village in terms of what its port looks like. And what you see is something that's beyond stark in terms of its comparison. The number of these vessels that are owned and operated by the Metlakatla fishermen. So these include, as I mentioned previously, 15 to 18 purse seiners. This is information from the annual reports produced by the Fish and Wildlife Division. As with much of southeast Alaska's purse seine fleet, it's an aging fleet. Their most recent vessels were built in the 1980s. And in inquiring about that, one of the things that is also I think a limiting factor or constraint on Metlakatla is that there are no designated federal loan programs for them to upgrade their technologies. And that would be of great significance because they have to deal with the state or private bank system, which are much more difficult in terms of meeting the qualifications. The 15 to 18 purse seiners operate each with a crew of 5 men. So you can see there's a substantial cohort of employment. And in order to be eligible to fish on Metlakatla as a vessel operator or as a crewman, you have to be a Metlakatla Indian community resident and member. So they have an identified. When I talked to several of the captains about the issue of getting crew, they said it was never a problem. There are always crewmen available, and there's a particular chain that comes out of the high schools of young men and their family lines going into fishing as an aspirational part of their future. Another very significant aspect of the continuity of that. There are 65 to 75 drift gill netters, each of whom generally occupy with are fished with 2 individuals. And so there are approximately 250 employed in commercial salmon fishing alone on an annual basis. Now the last 2 years have been very difficult throughout southeastern Alaska and southern southeast, and so the numbers have dipped somewhat in terms of the employment. But this is the average harvest by species and gear type between 2016, and I would point out that the years from 2013 to 2017 were enormously productive years in salmon productivity in southeastern Alaska. And so they do jump the numbers up a little bit in terms of the averages. But those represent the numbers that are taken by the fleet of the different species over time. I would mention in passing that under the king salmon, the provision for king salmon falls under the Pacific Salmon Treaty. The Pacific Salmon Treaty now controls the Chinook harvest because of the problem of the stocks throughout, Chinook stocks being challenged everywhere. So in this particular case, the federal government directly through that treaty provisions dictates the terms of the Chinook harvest, both to the state of Alaska and to the Annette Island Reservation. So they, unlike those other fisheries which are under tribal direction, the tribal management establishes the openings and closings and the seasons for the salmon fishery. Here's the ex-vessel value that is accrued by the salmon fleet over this particular time period. The 10-year average that you can see the later periods with the very large figures of 5 million a year, and but nevertheless down to 3 million. The last 2 years have been more like, on average, about the years 2007, 2008. 2019 is a pickup of some, but it doesn't approximate the years in the earlier period of time. Now, in addition to these fishing vessels and the employment and the opportunities that they provide, there is also, and has been for many years, the Annette Island Packing Company and Cold Storage. And it operated up until 1994, packing canned salmon, and then it shifted over to cold storage production. In the years between 2013 and 2018, the cannery was operated on a partnership agreement with Silver Bay Seafoods, who came in. And when it was operating under those terms, employment is about 200 individuals worked in the processing plant. Again, an extremely important contribution to a village economy that is not found in other parts of southeastern Alaska. Unlike the fishing circumstances, individuals can be hired to work at the cold storage plant with work permits and residence permits for the summer. And so that there is a portion of the workforce associated with this processing part of the enterprise comes from offshore. Now, particularly in the aftermath of the state's jurisdictional issues raised, from 1963, the federal government promulgated the fishing regulations. I'm not precisely sure how that was accomplished in that early period, but by 1975, with the establishment of the Indian Self-Determination Act, those rights to management and fish and wildlife regulation were delegated to the tribe. And it's at that time that the tribe began the development of their fish and wildlife management system. And they utilize, this is the building which is where the management is housed. The fisheries management employs about 6 individuals around the year, not just for salmon, but they have just concluded a sea cucumber, or would it be urchins? I forgot when or they just had one of those dive fisheries going on, and I forgot exactly what it was for. So they manage that as well. All of the harvests that are done are, the reports go to the state in terms of aggregated numbers. So the purse seine harvest and gillnet harvest are sent in as aggregated numbers. They are not sent in as individualized numbers. So an individual who owes a limited entry permit, his earnings from Annette Island would not be recorded in the state's records. And this is the designation for the Fish and Wildlife Management Office where they work out of and do their work. These are the Annette Island Reserve Fishery Management Districts. So internal to those districts are actually districts that originally were established by ADF&G. And the reserve thought the reservation personnel didn't think it was of any use to establish new ones. They just use those, and they have harvests and openings associated with those circumstances. The tribe manages 50 streams on the reservation process. No, it's more like 70, 50 of which produce pink salmon and 34 produce chum salmon. Tribal management plan provides for the annual surveys of 10 to 17 index streams, by which they then follow their productivity kinds of numbers in terms of how those are goal. Escapement goals have been set for the streams, and fisheries openings are regulated where there are stressed streams to be able to maximize return to those particular locations. In addition, beginning in 1977, the tribe built and operates the Tamgas Creek Fish Hatchery, which puts out sockeye, pinks, and chums with the purposes of enhancing the reservation fishery as well. Here you can see the hatchery grounds and the holding pins as well. The fishery management objectives that are found and are carried out, first of all, under federal guidelines with regard to the conservation, is to achieve spawning escapement needs, imposing any requirements that are reasonable and necessary for conservation. Secondly, and this is an important and interesting place to look at how this construct occurs and examine some of the derivatives, share the salmon resource fairly and equitably with other user groups fishing in state waters under state law and within the state fisheries management system. What precisely, how is that operationalized? Well, it's operationalized in the number of days that are open for the purse seiners and the gill netters by, I guess I would call it, a process of equilibration with the way in which state management operates. However, the Tsimshian managers said to me that they have a greater amount of flexibility to open and close seasons, and that they do so regularly in their own particular way. Now, what it means that sharing means is that the Annette Island fishermen in the Metlakatla community recognizes that fish from their streams are going to be caught in state waters by state fishermen. And likewise, fish from state streams will be caught by reservation fishermen in reservation waters. And so what there is, you will see an enumeration of the day's fish, of the average catch per day, and overall season catches as basically operationalization of this particular idea of sharing. In discussion, we might go into a little greater detail as to why that in fact occurs, but it may go back to the first line, which is a story not told, as to about why that occurs. There have never been any tagging studies done per se to examine that particular articulation. It was pointed out to me that the average escapement of about 250,000 to 300,000 on the Tsimshian to the reservation streams, and their average harvest at about 1.3 million, is that there's a rough approximation if one has a return ratio of 5 returns for every spawner. So there is an underlying calculus of equitability that is pursued for a number of reasons in this regard. Also, community maintenance. This is to promote the federal purpose in the establishment and maintenance of the Metlakatla Indian Reservation by providing income and employment to reservation individuals and the communities. And this is very important because the state of Alaska's limited entry legislation, it certainly can be argued in the macro about southeastern Alaska, is not presently being conducted for the purposes of the residents of Alaska, which is one of the constitutional mandates. In fact, over 60% of the southeast purse seine permits are held by non-residents of Alaska. The state has failed to adequately address these circumstances, not only in these fisheries, but in other fisheries throughout the state, which also likewise have a preponderance of non-Alaskan resident fishermen. The two most lucrative fisheries in the state, Southeast Purse Seine and Bristol Bay Drift Gillnet, fall into those advisories. Let alone do they not address the general constitutional principle of being for the benefit of the state's residents, let alone its indigenous rural residents who have been hammered by these policies on many different fronts. So in that juxtaposition and articulation, one can see not merely the sanity, but the wisdom of the decision of 100% of the Metlakatla residents in 1971 to vote to stay out of ANCSA in that regard. Another fascinating comparative note here is that the salmon fishery on the Annette Islands Reserve is the largest tribally managed salmon fishery in the United States. People may be familiar with the treaty fisheries of the treaty tribes in Puget Sound and on the Columbia River, but here's where the rubber hits the road in terms of actual numbers of salmon. And that's another part of how it is not a story not told, even in the context of Native American fisheries, in terms of what has gone on. So in conclusion, I took this picture and had the opportunity to conduct a short interview with this gentleman whose name is Louis Wagner. He's standing before his Purse Seine vessel in one of the boat harbors down there. Louis indicated to me that his grandfather, beginning back in the 19-teens, was one of the early fishermen of the Tsimshian Reservation. So too was his father. So too is himself at age 71. And his son, in the background you can see there's another vessel called the Coastal Pride, which he rebuilt with his son for them to be able to have two vessels in the family. And his son is now in the process of training and preparing his own son to be a salmon fisherman on Metlakatla and Annette Islands. 5 generations of continuous family salmon fishermen on the Metlakatla Annette Islands Indian Reservation. Reservation, as through its tribal sovereignty, manages its resources and carries out its mission to benefit its residents through these fisheries. On that note, I'll end my comments and take whatever questions people might have. So thank you very much for Sir. Yep.
Early on one of your timelines, you indicate, I think it was 1923 or something, that the Annette Island reservation was judicially recognized. And was there congressional action, or was it some court said?
It was a court setting. It's the famous Alaska Packers case in which it was challenged about the status of the reserve and its purposes. And in the judgment, in the judicial court decision, that language that it was established as a reservation for the benefit of its residents is in that judicial decision.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate it. It's fascinating to learn about this untold story. And I have a question regarding one aspect of the untold story, and it relates to the state with regard to limited entry, failing to recognize landings at the Annette Island Packing Company for purposes of eligibility. Can you comment on that? What the rationale was and what the impact was? Thank you.
Well, I'd have to go back and talk to somebody like Bruce Twomley or something to find out what their particular rationale is. It's a matter of judgment call. Seems to me if one takes the position that the Annette Island Reservation waters are not a part of Alaska, then fishing within them would not be considered legal from the purposes of establishing your fishing history in the waters of Alaska. That's a judgment call. One could likewise make a judgment call that those waters are a part of the internal boundaries of Alaska, and therefore, and the fact, a secondary part of it is where the landings were made. They're made in an alien place, I guess. I don't know. It seems to me like Metlakatla had a packing company, and so that's a secondary part of it is, first of all, where the fish were caught to be landed there, where those landings actually occurred. There were judgment calls, and they did have, as I mentioned, a deleterious impact. And that's what the Metlakatla leadership says, that many of our people who had fished everywhere, that basically pushed them down below the lines of eligibility to have the point totals necessary to receive the permits. So the impact is from there, and now, once that capitalized asset is in place, they have to husband those resources very, very tightly. And because it is a community, a very strong community with a very strong identity and recognition of the significance, I believe that they will have programmatic ways to make sure that they don't lose any more of those limited entry permits. But one of the interesting things about the permits and the fishing, when I asked, well, how do the guys who hold them, how do they utilize those purse seine permits or gillnet? And what they said is basically they only now fish at the hatchery openings. They will leave Metlakatla to go up to hatchery openings outside of Sitka that are earlier than the general openings or later in the fall. But when you have concurrent openings in the state and in Metlakatla, they come back and fish in Metlakatla. So that's the way in which those limited entry purse seine guys actually use their permits in that particular fashion. It seems to me it could happen at some point that those permits may just be transferred to another Tsimshian fisherman who may then just fish in the waters, which they could do as a strategy. But one of the things I pointed out is that they don't have any access to any federal funding that could give them a particular point of leverage in regard to those circumstances. Yeah. Tom, you had a question.
Thanks, Steve. I want to follow up on the financing because you mentioned that they had the BIA loan program, I guess.
No. I said they
never,
do not have a BIA.
But did they back when they were before 1971 or whenever you mentioned? Because there was this great loan program that a lot of communities tried to take advantage.
Yeah, under the context of the Alaska IRA, when Paul put that in place. I've forgotten to see whether they have IRA provisions for their business community. Their business have, so I don't know about whether they used it for loans. I think that they did, probably for their plants, but
right, for the original packing plant. That's what I was asking.
Not for the original plant. The original plant was built with their sawmill and their labor and everything else back in the 1920s. But they could, after IRA, they could have used those funds potentially for vessel purchases like other communities did. I don't have the answer to that part of the question.
Well, that was what I was curious about because what I guess other communities like Angoon got access to those and tried to buy their processing facilities, and then a lot of it didn't work out. They burned or whatever. Right. But the second part is the financing of permits, and maybe you're starting to get at this. So do they have a mechanism for,
no, I think what they are looking at quite carefully is are models in which what is lacking everywhere is the existence of what I call intermediate institutions, where permits can be held for reallocation and revisiting to members of a community, something that the state has precluded existing anywhere where the loss of permits has damaged rural communities. But they have internally given thought to it. Thus far, those permits have stayed in those family lines under moral responsibilities for the most part. I didn't look carefully and closely to see if there had been any attrition due to sales externally, but that was the oral reports that I received. Yeah.
And then for maintenance of those of the older fleet, do they have any micro
Well, they used to
loans
have.
or
I have a slide here of their ways where they bring vessels up. They have a big vessel maintenance facility, but yeah, they have. Well, that's the other part of it. I said the employees. So when we talk about the employees at that cannery, we're talking about, of course, the online processing employees, but we're talking about, as in any, is the various different mechanics and vessel repairmen, net people. All of that would be a part of the original employment cohort that's ongoing. A note to that respect, this is the first year, I think they said, in over 80 in which they did not directly buy fish on the land in Metlakatla. Their Silver Bay processing agreement was not renewed, and so they're now looking at trying to get funding. They have to upgrade their cold storage. It operates on old batching system, and they need a new system that will allow them to once again return to employment. But that's a high objective for the tribe, is to get that accomplished, get those things done again. Yeah.
All right, can you say something about the herring fishery?
I was going to talk to you about it because I've gotten down these guys' description of that, because absolutely. Yeah, it's a very interesting model. We'll talk about that separately in terms of that's something that needs to be documented, is how they approach it. They approach it in very different models than the state does. Yeah, good question. Mason.
Steve, following up on that limited entry question, do you know, has there been much research done? So 1973, the limited entry system is instituted in the state fisheries. Has there been much research on the impacts in Southeast Native communities of that system?
Funny you should ask. Actually, in looking at the actual impacts and the multiplicity of the spin-off effect of those things, those are the true impacts, is how these ripple through the society and the culture and the economy. That really hasn't been done. But I initiated a study in 1980 under the leadership of the only Native majority leader since statehood, Nels Anderson, to establish a system that looked at the way in which permits were transferred. And at that time, I told Nels the tracking system has to include a Native categorization of the permit holding. To this day, you cannot go to the state commercial fisheries entry or any other institution and find any record of Native ownership. Understand that there is a certain state policy that very rarely, and I don't know, Tom and I may go, very rarely in its databases does it designate and recognize the existence of Alaska Natives as a discrete cohort of their population. Now, that study that I initiated in 1980 showed right at that time the dramatic outflow of the permits from especially these high value permits, especially from the rural villages. And that's continued on over time. They have reached a very low plateau level most places. And it's also true throughout the Gulf of Alaska and up into Bristol Bay. So we know, and the state of Alaska knows, using a category called Alaska Rural Local, which is what I ginned up so that I wouldn't have to look at Native, the tracking of those permits can be seen, both as a function of sales to outsiders and the migration of permits. But so it is well known, and that knowledge came into the federal government with regard to its allocation of halibut quota rights. I was on the body that said it's going to do the same thing. You capitalize that resource, it'll have the same impact on rural villages and Alaska Natives as limited entry. Lo and behold, that is exactly what's happened. So the villages have lost not merely their salmon permits, but the halibut fisheries that were a part of it as well have been decimated and eroded as well. And frankly, that you have to see it as a question of justice, and justice is not necessarily a part of the political framework. Very difficult to get into this individualized notion of these permit ownership, or to carefully examine what the consequences or the emergence of these intermediate institutions that I talked about. So in answer to the question, we know what's happened to those permits, and they adopted my system and they put out reports now. The Commercial Fisheries Entry Commission will take my system of analysis and give you a report every year on what's happened. So too, the Halibut IFQ Quota Committee adopted my system, and they examined the incidence and movement of quota on that same kind of basis. So we know, we don't know native because the state of Alaska will not engage in the designation of native, but we know what it's done to the communities that have native residents.
And you said 60% of purse seine permit holders are out of state? Is that
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Got a question, Chuck? No. Oh, okay, go right ahead.
Before we all thank Steve, I just, want to put out there also the contrast between Metlakatla and what would have happened if some of their fisheries reserve proposals put forward in the 40s for IRA governments had succeeded, and had the Forest Service not sought to, through political actions in Congress, to get Department of Interior to back off on those. The situation in Southeast Villages might be very different today. There were, I forget how many were proposed, but yeah, but that's an interesting commentary. And I do have a question about the marketing that was needed to overcome that original cap, and throughout their evolution of the fishery to be successful. That's another part of the story. Right?
Well, the APA luckily fell apart. That was, the Alaska Packers Association wasn't able to persist. But it's astonishing that the Alaska Packers Association, I've forgotten it, as a, the term evades me. Bentham's notion of this overseeing notion from the middle of the APA's qualities as a panopticon, being able to see everything on the salmon landscape is truly astonishing. What I saw, that how quickly they were able to do that. But back to Chuck's point about the reserves, those were a highly controversial issue. But the three communities that brought those hearings to a head under the Judge Hanna rulings that Chuck is alluding to in 1944. If you go back and you look at the maps, it was only Heidelberg, and of course Heidelberg has lots of intermarriage and relationship with Metlakatla. So guess who knew what was the benefits of the Metlakatla reservation system? Heidelberg got a 3,000 foot reserve. That's where the 3,000, oh, just a footnote, why was it 3,000 feet? Well, the guys at Metlakatla said because that was the limit on the original standing traps. Original standing traps could extend 3,000 feet offshore. So that in order to protect the reserve from those, that's why the 3,000 feet came into operation, which is fascinating. But in the 1944 Hanna judgments were horrific from the vantage point of the way in which the testimony was received by the villagers of especially Cake and Klawock. Uninformed in terms of the clan system and Hanna's notion of abandonment was legally already past judgment, the notion of abandonment. But the Haidas got a 3,000 foot reserve. It was far limited and in terms of its spatial extent away from the village. And it should have gone down somewhat further, but it would have impinged upon more traps. But it was established in 1949, the vote taken at that time, there was a majority. It wasn't anything like the 100% down in Metlakatla, but there was a majority of over 60% voted for the Heidelberg Reserve. And then the industry attacked it in court, attacked its establishment as a restraint of free trade. And they had the right kind of judge at that particular time who overthrew the Heidelberg Reservation in 1952. Now, Klawock was given a boundary that did not include 3,000 foot offshore. It only went to mean high water. And there was a lot of, Klawock sources say that there was divided opinions at that time on it, but that the prevailing notion coming through some of the Paratoviches is that a reservation meant that you would be constrained to motion. Well, a careful look at the Metlacatlans would have discovered those guys as a reservation, they've never been constrained in terms of their movement on and off the reserve. But the crucial thing both in Cake and Klawock was that there was no 3,000-foot portion that they could have. Cake went ahead and established traps on, I'm not sure what lands they actually established the tail holds for their traps there because they didn't have a reserve. But that was the upshot in terms of what happened there. And it's also related, as you noted, Chuck, to the 1947 decisions about the forest and the failure to protect forest rights of Alaska Native Southeast villagers. Okay, yeah. All right. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate your attention. Thank you very much.